In May 2013, Sarah Pinsky faced trial for her role in a £1 billion mobile phone tax scam in the UK. She was part of a group of 18 criminals who bought cell phones without paying VAT, value-added tax, and sold them without paying taxes. Sarah's task was to launder the money, which amounted to about £1 billion or roughly $1.3 billion US dollars. Just before her trial concluded, Sarah fled and remained on the run for nearly 10 years until she was captured recently. Throughout her time evading capture, she was the only woman on the UK's most wanted list. Pinsky had been born and raised in Falford, near York in the UK, but had closed family connections in Spain. She was also fluent in Spanish and had primary residence in Spain during her trial. So it didn't come as a shock in 2015 when authorities discovered her husband was bringing her supplies in Oliveira, Spain. She was reported to have rarely left her hideout, and her husband or family members had been supporting her while she evaded authorities. In 2015, an extensive operation had been undertaken to recapture Pinsky, but something had tipped her off and she managed to escape. In 2017, the ringleader of the operation, Jeffrey Johnson, was arrested in Dubai and was extradited back to the UK to serve his 24 sentence for his crime. Eventually, Pinsky was the final person in the operation to still be on the run. The other people either turned themselves in or had been captured. After 2015, she cut off all ties with her family and went even deeper into hiding. It was estimated that in 2013 she may have had at least £2.4 million in cash, and she with her that she had been required to relinquish to the courts. When her father passed in 2020, there had been renewed hopes that she might resurface, but she did not. In February 2022, a resident in Santa Barbara, Spain, reported the sighting of a woman who matched Pinsky's description. A task force that specializes in recapturing wanted fugitives called the Civil Guard Central Operative Unit's Fugitive Task Force was called in to carry out the arrest. They found the woman living in an apartment and followed her for several weeks. Now 47, Pinsky, either out of necessity or the belief that she wasn't actively being searched for, Edward lacked some of her previous methods and seemed to be living a relatively normal life. Santa Barbara was a small village of around 4,000 people, and perhaps she felt safe to resume a normal life. They arrested her on March 1st while walking her 2 dogs, and she is being held in prison while she waits extradition back to the UK. Just on her original conviction alone, she faces 20 years in prison, though her time on the run has likely added more time to her sentence. The NCA International Deputy Director Tom Dowdle said about the arrest, "This should serve as a warning to others on our most wanted list. We will not rest until you are captured, no matter how long it takes." What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Karen Vilak was sitting in her Stratford, New Jersey home on March 1st when she heard several loud knocks on her door. She opened it and was shocked to see a little girl on her doorstep. She recognized the 13-year-old, whose name has been withheld from the media due to her age, as her neighbor's child. The girl begged for help and handed her a shock collar meant for large dogs. Karen brought the girl into her home while her husband called 911. The girl had marks on her necks from the shock collar, and when asked what happened, revealed that she was made to wear the collar when she was bad by her parental guardian. She also revealed several other instances of abuse, such as being deprived of food and clothing, as well as being duct-taped in the basement for hours. A girl was taken to the hospital where she was immediately removed from custody of Kelly Minogue. The exact relationship has not been disclosed to protect the identity of the child. Kelly Minogue was arrested along with her 2 adult daughters, Rachel and Rebecca Minogue. Kelly's father also lived in the home, and when being questioned by police, confirmed allegations made by the child. The girl only weighed 63 pounds and said that the abuse started in 2018 when she was 9 years old. She told law enforcement she had been abused by all 3 women in the house and had even been forced to shoplift for the women. You can hear in the winter through the windows, always yelling and fighting. And while at the hospital, she had several marks on her neck consistent with wearing a shock collar for extended periods of time. The little girl is with the foster family now and has since returned to school. All 3 women have denied allegations of abuse. They are all being held in the Camden County Jail while they await trial. They face charges of aggravated assault, child abuse, and neglect. It was on March 2nd when friends of 57-year-old Cynthia Cole reported her missing. Normally active on social media, friends became concerned when her feet abruptly stopped. She lived alone, and what initially was a welfare check turned into a missing person investigation. She had been last seen attending an outdoor concert in Jensen Beach on February 24th. She had attended the event with a group of friends who saw her leave in her 2015 Jeep Cherokee early on in the evening. When officers arrived at her house, there were no signs of forced entry or anything amiss in the home. Her cell phone was found in the home with a dead battery. The only thing that seemed to be missing was her Jeep Cherokee, but it was later recovered abandoned on the highway. Cynthia had a doorbell camera, and when officers pulled the footage, they saw something unusual. Cynthia returned home a little bit after 8 p.m., and on the doorbell camera they saw a man leaving her residence half an hour after she got home, and the man took her car. On the cell phone, they found a contact that matched the physical description of the unknown man from the doorbell camera. 34-year-old Kyoki Hilo Demick. Demick had a criminal history. In fact, he was required to register as a sex offender. He had been convicted in 2004 for burglary and assault of a minor, and the victim was 12. For several years, Demick had worked for Cynthia on her property as a handyman. Text messages between the two showed conversations about the work he was to do, as well as Cash App transactions. When Demick had been brought in for questioning, investigators had caught him in several lies about the night Cynthia went missing. Initially, he told law enforcement he didn't know her, and then he said he did know her and that he only did odd jobs here and there. When asked if he'd gone to her house that night, he said no, and initially claimed to have not been at the house in days. He also was caught in several lies about his cell phone. Officers asked him to hand it over for the investigation. He said it was lost. Cynthia's car had been abandoned a mile from his home, and when asked about that, he first said he had no idea about the car. When shown surveillance footage clearly showing him at the house, he claimed he'd gone by to collect money owed. He first said he walked home after that, and then he later said Ms. Cole had asked him to drive her car. The interrogation had done its job, dismantling every lie that Demick attempted. Officers continued the investigation, and in the search of the backyard, they discovered something unusual about the cover of the property's septic tank. Further inspection prompted the discovery of Cynthia Cole's body. Demick was arrested on March 4th. Officers have hypothesized, based on the evidence, that he had gone into the home around 7 p.m. that night and waited until Cynthia came home. They estimated that she died within 30 minutes of coming home, and he had already prepared the septic tank as storage for her body. No specific motive for the crime has been released. It is also believed that she wasn't aware of Demick's criminal history or that he was a registered sex offender. Demick is being held on a $750,000 bond while he waits trial. It was 8:30 p.m. on March 10th in Manhattan when Barbara Guster stepped out of her building. She was heading out to see one of her students perform. The 86-year-old grandmother was a beloved vocal coach to generations of Broadway stars and was still very active in the musical community. She was just about to hail a cab when a woman walked past her, shoved her to the ground, and swore at her. It had been a violent shove, and Ms. Guster hit her head hard on the concrete. As well as a passing cyclist helped Ms. Guster back into the building. She had a severe head wound that was bleeding profusely, but she maintained consciousness. Police in an ambulance arrived within minutes, and Ms. Guster was able to give a brief description of her attacker, who she didn't know. She was taken to the hospital, but days later unfortunately died of her injuries from the fall. The death had been a shock to those who knew her. Many described her as a tough cookie, who still exercised daily and was seen often briskly walking around the neighborhood. The attacker was not found that evening, but officers were able to find surveillance footage and were able to get a clear picture of what she looked like. Officers later determined that the woman had stuck around, waiting nearby for nearly 20 minutes while she watched the older woman get taken away in an ambulance before heading to the subway. And a tip from the public brought investigators to Long Island and gave them a name: Lauren Pazienza, a 26-year-old woman who worked as a designer in Manhattan. 2 weeks after the attack, she was surrendered to law enforcement with her lawyer in tow. New details have emerged regarding the timeline of the days following the attack. which until the conviction are still allegations. After the attack, Lauren stuck around nearby and waited until after the ambulance left. Then, according to surveillance, she got into a physical altercation with her fiancé. The two took the subway to their apartment where Lauren began the process of deleting her entire social media presence. In the days following the attack, Lauren left New York to stay with her parents in Long Island and left her cell phone with an aunt. When officers first arrived at her parents' house in Long Island, her father refused to let officers in without a search warrant and said his daughter was not there, and she surrendered the next day. Lauren Pazienza is charged with manslaughter and is being held on a $500,000 cash bail or a $1 million bond. Bail was set high because the judge deemed Lauren a flight risk. She has had no previous criminal history. She comes from a very privileged background. According to a former friend, Lauren's a poster child for white privilege. She has never faced any consequences in her life. She was enabled by her parents who got her out of everything, but she called them stupid and basic. She is continuing to maintain her innocence and has not revealed what prompted the senseless attack on a stranger. More to follow on this case. Pazienza still might be offered a plea bargain, but this could also go to trial. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Sasha Samsam, age 27, worked as a social media manager at an Orlando real estate agency. Known for her vibrant energy, sociable nature, and intelligence, Sasha was more than just a pretty face, as her colleagues often noted. She was highly skilled at her job, promoting places like the Edge Apartments in Orlando. Her co-workers admired her dedication to her work and how she thrived in that environment. According to her friends, Sasha approached life with enthusiasm, balancing hard work with enjoyment of every day and every opportunity. Recently, she had moved into a lovely new home at Uptown Place Apartments on 911 North Orange Avenue, marking a new and exciting chapter in her life. It was the last day of the Orlando soccer season, and Sasha was out in purple to support her team. When they won, she and her friends headed out to celebrate with drinks and dancing at the Attic nightclub on 68 East Pine Street. At around midnight, Sasha decided it was time to leave Attic. She told one of her friends, Anthony, that she was heading off. Anthony said as friends they would all frequently separate and meet back up later at another bar or club. So with this, everyone carried on enjoying their evening and went their separate ways. She and Anthony had made plans to meet up for breakfast the next morning, but he ordered and ate alone. Sasha didn't show up and wasn't replying to Anthony's texts. He assumed that she was simply hungover and sleeping it off. But hours passed, and with still nothing from Sasha, Anthony became concerned. Sasha was always active on her phone and social media, and something just wasn't sitting right with him. He reached out to two of the friends, and they both agreed to go with him to Sasha's apartment. When they pulled into the parking lot, they spotted Sasha's car. In the back seat was a gift that she was supposed to be taking to a baby shower that day. They banged on apartment 345, but got no response. Anthony phoned 911. Police in the building's security entered her third-floor apartment at 8 p.m. that night to do a welfare check. The apartment was still locked and there were no signs of a forced entry. Everything was silent and nothing in the kitchen or lounge area appeared to be disturbed. But in Sasha's bedroom, officers saw some hair coming out from under the duvet and a hand hanging off the edge of the bed. They had found Sasha Samsam. She had been raped and strangled to death. She had strangle marks around her neck and she had been beaten too. She had defensive wounds to her arms and abrasions that were consistent with someone restraining her. Her necklace had been snatched off and it was caught in her hair. Her shirt and bra had been ripped open and her underwear had been forcibly removed, which had left abrasions on her body. Friends, family, and coworkers had absolutely no idea who would have ever wanted to hurt Sasha. And no one could offer up any names of potential suspects to the police. Sasha's purse, phone, and key fob to the building were all missing, and the bedroom smelled strongly of cleaning products. There were some discolored patches on the bedsheets that looked as if they had been caused by bleach. The cupboard where Sasha kept all of her cleaning supplies had the doors wide open. Police noted that the toilet seat had been left up, something which didn't seem impossible but definitely unusual seeing as Sasha lived alone. After this, they found a condom wrapper near the bed and the imprint of a shoe. After swabbing the underneath of the toilet seat, they found 2 fingerprints. They also swabbed Sasha's body for any DNA. While performing the autopsy, the medical examiner said he had never seen an internal neck fracture as severe as Sasha's. As well as the 15 cameras from around the building, Uptown Place had on-site security. Stephen Duxbury had been a security guard there for about 5 months, and he had seen Sasha coming home that morning. He told police he didn't actually let her in, as she had no ID and no keys to the building. She got in through another resident that opened the door for her. Stephen then went looking for her in the building, and when he finally found her, she was trying and failing to input the code to get into her apartment. Sasha asked him if he could walk her to her car to see if her keys were in there. But as the pair got outside, she said she suddenly remembered the code and ran back in. But when he returned a little while after, she was gone. But later on, Stephen said he saw Sasha in the building again. This time, she was with a man he hadn't seen around before. Police needed to find out who this mystery man was, and fast. Looking at Sasha's movements from that night, from the attic nightclub where she left her friends, it was around a half-an-hour walk away to get to her apartment building. Although it was a very busy night in town, police managed to spot her on several cameras. She was wearing white jeans and a purple top and stood out quite clearly. Another camera from down the street showed her again. This time she was walking with 2 people. Police used this footage to issue a press release, hoping whoever was with her would come forward, and to their relief, they did. 2 women said they had seen Sasha downtown that night and could tell she was intoxicated. Sasha had no ID on her and no phone. The women said they were concerned for her safety and decided to get an Uber with her and drop her home. As soon as the Uber stopped at some traffic lights, Sasha darted out, pointing to Uptown Place, saying that was where she lived. The women waited as she tried to enter the building, but because she didn't have her key fob, she was unsuccessful. Before long, security guard Stephen approached the 3 women. He told them he couldn't let anyone into the building without identification or proof that they were a resident. The women told him how concerned they were for her, and asked how she would stay safe if he wouldn't let her in. As they continued to talk, another resident of the building opened the door and let Sasha inside. Stephen carried on talking to the other women for a while, before eventually heading back into the building to see where Sasha was. Everyone's story matched up, and police still needed footage and witnesses from inside Uptown Place. Sasha's iPad was found in her apartment, and as it shared some data with her iPhone, police were able to look at her messages. A text had been sent to a man named Ben who had previously dated Sasha. He was supposed to be seeing her that weekend. They had been texting during the night, and Ben asked her if she wanted to meet him at another party. But several hours later at 5:12 a.m., Sasha sent him a text message simply saying, "Ben." This appeared to be the last activity on her devices. Ben willingly let the police take a DNA sample, and with that, plus a watertight alibi, he was quickly ruled out. Police also spoke to a man named Taylor, who was in a relationship with Sasha for 2 years. They had still spoken regularly, and Taylor said he always thought that one day they might get back together. He was working a shift at a bar that night, which everyone could attest to, and again through DNA, he was eliminated from the investigation. Just a few days after Sasha was found, she was laid to rest in a private ceremony, which blended Hindu, Islamic, and Christian practices. One of her co-workers recalled that he always knew she was popular and well-loved, but didn't quite realize the impact she had on so many people until he saw the turnout at her funeral. The CCTV footage from Uptown Place was always saved off-site, but it was now finally in the hands of the police, and they began going through it with a fine-tooth comb. One camera showed Sasha entering the building at around 1:46 a.m. She was followed inside by an unknown male who asked her if she was all right. She then headed up the stairs and disappeared from view for around 20 minutes. At 2:06 a.m., she was seen running up more stairs, followed by security guard Stephen. Just as he said, He walked with her to the first-floor parking lot at 2:25 a.m. to see if her keys were in her car. But as soon as Sasha said she remembered the code, the pair walked back inside. Police were still searching to find the unknown male seen with Sasha, but they couldn't see Sasha on any of the other tapes. They appealed to the media and public and asked anyone that had seen Sasha or anyone else around the building after 1:46 a.m. to come forward. But no one did. Investigators continued evaluating the footage to see if they'd missed anyone else coming in or out of Uptown Place in the early hours. And at 6:36 a.m. on one of the cameras, they did find something of interest. A familiar face was seen exiting the second floor of the building, holding 2 trash bags. It was security guard Stephen Duxbury. He walked into the second floor of the parking lot where his car was parked and returned to the building at 6:38 a.m. Stephen had told officers that his shift had ended at 6 a.m., but he didn't actually leave the building until 6:39 a.m. Initially, police wondered if taking out the trash was part of the security guard's job, but it was soon confirmed that it most definitely wasn't. On closer inspection, detectives recognized the trash bags. They had come from inside Sasha's apartment. Following this, police obtained a search warrant for Duxbury's home and asked him to come in for a polygraph test. During the polygraph, he was asked if he had ever set foot inside Sasha's apartment. He answered no, but the polygraph indicated deception. The interviewer then asked him if he knew how Sasha had died. Was she poisoned? He asked. No. Was she stabbed? No. Was she choked? No. But on this question, again, his heart rate shot up and showed signs of deception. Information about how Sasha had been killed had not yet been released to the public, and there was absolutely no way of Stephen knowing that she had been strangled. Although a polygraph test is inadmissible in a courtroom, this definitely gave officers a lot more to look into. In Stephen's home, detectives found a pair of shoes that matched the shoe print found inside Sasha's apartment. And 3 days later, police learned that the thumbprint under the toilet seat matched the right thumb of Stephen Duxbury. The DNA found on Sasha's chest also belonged to him. His phone record showed that a disturbing Google search had been made. He had looked up how to override a quick-set keypad lock, the same lock Sasha had on her apartment door. This internet search had happened at around 5 a.m. that morning, almost 3 hours after Sasha had last been seen on camera, and just a few minutes before Sasha had sent the message to her ex-boyfriend Ben, simply saying his name. Stephen also had a bite mark on his forearm and scratches to his body. It was hard to fathom that the man who had been so helpful with the police and whose job it was to secure the building and protect the residents had been the one to commit this horrific crime. Police believe that when he saw Sasha come home that morning, he saw it as nothing more than a twisted opportunity. They believed he broke into her apartment before sexually assaulting, attacking, and killing her. He then used her own cleaning products in an attempt to destroy any DNA before taking things of evidentiary value out of her apartment to his car, where he disposed of them later. His trial began in November 2017, with Judge Lisa T. Munyon presiding. It started with Stephen arguing that, as a security officer, he thought he had to cooperate with law enforcement during his questioning, otherwise he would lose his license, and his defense team wanted his initial interviews with the police kept out of the courtroom. Duxbury's attorney Aaron Delgado argued that the investigation left too many unanswered questions. Among them was not testing Stephen's clothing for DNA. They also said that the shoe prints attributed to Stephen inside Sasha's apartment appeared to match a size 9 shoe found in his apartment when he said he wore a size 10.5. His legal team also argued that there was no surveillance footage that placed Duxbury in her apartment or showed him entering it. But the prosecution said that although the case was largely circumstantial, it didn't make it any less strong. DNA put him inside her apartment, even though video footage didn't. This, alongside the Google searches and the removing of the trash bags, was again enough to show they didn't need CCTV to prove Duxbury was in that apartment. When asked about the abrasions to her inner thigh area and lower body, the medical examiner said that it was definitely a possibility. The marks could have been made by a utility or security belt during intercourse. The defense even made the suggestion that another person could have broken in and committed the murder after Sasha and Stephen had consensual sex. But prosecutor William J. simply said, "Her body doesn't tell lies." The scene doesn't tell lies. Following a 7-day trial and just 4 hours of deliberations, Stephen Duxbury was handed a life sentence without the possibility of parole for the murder of Sasha Samsam. He was sentenced to a further 15 years for attempted sexual battery with a deadly weapon or force, and burglary with assault or battery. Circuit Judge Lisa T. Munyan ordered the sentences should run consecutively. Stephen declined to speak when the judge gave him the opportunity after the verdict. Sasha Samsadine's parents both expressed their sympathy for Duxbury's mother, who sat through the trial in the back row of the courtroom. They acknowledged that his parents had now lost their child too. Sasha's mother Tara also expressed her anger at how the defense team had tried to represent her daughter's character in the courtroom. Tara said, "I won't have birthdays. Her father will never get to walk her down the aisle. I've attended a lot of weddings since then, and every wedding I attend I know we will never have that for my daughter." Sasha Samsadine's family has a pending lawsuit against the apartment complex that employed Stephen Duxbury and the security company Spectrum Brands, which manufactured the lock on Sasha's door. The 102-page lawsuit alleges that the apartment complex and Vital Security, which employed Duxbury, ignored other residents' complaints that they felt harassed by Stephen. The Samsadine's attorney is also trying to convince a judge that the lock on Sasha's, and that's possibly how Stephen got inside. At a hearing, attorney Samantha Duke, representing Spectrum Brands, said there was no way to know for sure because the lock was never collected as evidence by the Orlando police, and it was thrown away by the owner of the unit when a new tenant moved in. The Samsadine's attorney fired back, saying that Spectrum Brands knew its product was defective, citing an article that describes how someone could beat the lock in a matter of seconds with something as simple as a screwdriver. In February 2019, Stephen filed an appeal claiming that the court had made a mistake in denying his motion to suppress his post-Miranda statements and in denying his motion for acquittal on the attempted sexual battery charge. This appeal was denied. Ken and Tara Samsadian worked to honor their daughter's legacy by working with the Orange County Sheriff's Office to help other families deal with the grief that comes with being a victim, someone who undoubtedly had so much more to achieve in her life. One of her friends and coworkers said, "Sasha was such a beautiful soul who cared about so many people. She made such an impact." Her loved ones continue to celebrate her life, her amazing qualities, and strive to keep her vibrant energy alive. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. On Friday, October 18th, 1974, on Springfield Road in Mitchum's Corner, Cambridge, a 20-year-old woman was getting ready for bed when the lights suddenly went out. She heard noises from downstairs, and as footsteps began to ascend the stairs, she realized with fear that someone had broken into her house. Before she knew it, a man was standing in her room. He said to her, "I came to rob, but I'll stay to rape." He then subjected her to a horrifying sexual attack. Before leaving, he also stole a small amount of money from the house. She survived her ordeal and told the officers that the attacker was short and young. One of the detectives working on the case was Detective Superintendent Bernard Hodson. He was the deputy of Cambridge CID, and he would eventually lead the investigation. According to him, the description given made things incredibly difficult for the investigators, as it could have been most of the men in Cambridge. An attack like this was immediately picked up by the Cambridge Evening News. Reporter Eddie Duller said this kind of crime just didn't happen in the city, especially something so violent. However, due to the lack of details, it only got a small paragraph on the inside pages. Hodson was sure that this was an opportunistic attack, meaning it was impossible to know when or where the rapist would strike next. It wouldn't be long before he would commit his next attack. A woman was at home on Abbey Road. After getting out of the bath and leaving the bathroom, the lights in her house suddenly went out. As she called out into the darkness, a man in a long wig ran up the stairs at her. Like the woman 2 weeks earlier, she was raped before the attacker fled the house, leaving his victim terrified and traumatized. Another similarity was that he would talk to the victims for several minutes and describe exactly what he was going to do. She gave the police the same description as the first victim. The attacker was short and young. Police soon connected the two attacks as it appeared there was a pattern emerging. He would strike at night after breaking in, where a young woman was home alone. Police began trying to find evidence that could forensically link the two attacks and confirm if they were carried out by the same person. The victim's clothes were sent for analysis. This was before the time of DNA profiling, so the scientific task before the team was enormous. But police carried out searches and door-to-door inquiries to try and gain any information. Despite the best efforts of investigators, nobody came forward. As the two attacks had occurred on a Friday night, the following Friday police set up roadblocks throughout Cambridge and stopped and interviewed any man that fit the description. The weekend came and went and the attacker hadn't struck, so the roadblocks were taken away. But the Monday after, he struck again, this time on Huntingdon Road. A young woman was at home in her small flat opposite Fitzwilliam College in an all-female house. She was originally from Australia and was packing her things to make the trip home, sometime between 7:30 and 8 p.m. After hearing a noise coming from the front door at 8:50, she went to investigate. She was confronted by a man in a long wig. He was wearing little other than a blanket. He attempted to attack her, but she fought back, kneeing him in his stomach and ripping the wig off his head. He quickly ran off into the night before she threw the wig after him and slammed the door shut. He returned not long after to retrieve the wig that she had thrown back at him, removing a vital piece of evidence from the scene. After being alerted, police quickly descended on Huntington Road, but the attacker was long gone. Investigators now knew that the perpetrator was disguising himself with wigs, but what they couldn't work out was how he was able to evade capture so quickly. Homerton is a woman-only college at Cambridge University, situated in a beautiful old Victorian house. Students would come and go to practice their music, and many of the rooms were soundproof. Although the third attack had been thwarted, he was not going to give up that easily. Just 2 days later, he struck again. Prior to this, the attacker had struck where people lived in bedsits, but this changed on the night of Wednesday, the 13th of November. On this occasion, he would take his crime spree into the colleges of the university. He broke into Homerton and abducted one of the women as she rehearsed in a music room. He used what investigators later believed to be some kind of chloroform or ether to subdue her. He then dragged her out of the house and took her across the grounds. He subjected her to a horrifying sexual assault, and just like all the women before her, she couldn't give an accurate description, nor could she identify him. Police were becoming increasingly worried as he had now used drugs to overpower his victims, meaning his confidence was growing. The women of Cambridge were terrified as he had now upped the ante by breaking into the campus, a place where students ought to have felt safe. I mean, we all work all the way around Cambridge and we sort of collect each other as we come home. And so this is the main thing, we're never on our own, ever. The police needed to make sure that the women in the city were able to protect themselves. So crime prevention officers were on hand to deliver talks, to help women secure their homes and teach them self-defense strategies in case they were attacked. At the time, the supermarket chain Woolworths sold a multifunctional torch that doubled as an alarm. Within an hour of the crime prevention officers giving their talk, the Woolworths store in Cambridge had completely sold out. Within a month, 4 women had been attacked and the police were no closer to catching the culprit. The police also knew that these were not separate attacks. These were committed by one incredibly violent and dangerous offender. Based on the descriptions of the survivors, the police were able to produce a photo fit of the man they were looking for. The incident room at the police station was being staffed 24/7 to take in any tips people had, and everything was noted down. The UK media descended on Cambridge, and the pressure was growing every day for the police. The picturesque city had now become the center of a media firestorm. In a desperate bid to stop further attacks, checkpoints had increased throughout the city, and more police were drafted in to help with the investigation. A month would pass with no attacks, but on the night of Sunday, the 8th of December, in a bedsit on Allstone Road, he struck again. A woman was asleep upstairs when she was awoken by a man in her room. After manhandling her down the stairs, they went past the room of a couple who also lived at the property. They heard the woman protesting and repeatedly saying no, but unfortunately, neither investigated what was going on. He took her out into the garden, where she was tied up and raped. This showed that he was growing in confidence as he had now changed his MO. He normally attacked women who lived on their own, but he had now attacked someone who lived with other people. However, this was also where he had made his first massive mistake. After he left, the victim heard her attacker cycling away. Police now knew that this was how he was evading them. He was using his bike to travel the back streets and alleyways of Cambridge to escape the roadblocks. This also meant he most likely was local to the area and knew it well. As the next week rolled around, there was another attack in Cambridge. He broke into a house located on Victoria Road. One of the residents who lived there said it was around 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and her boyfriend was staying with her. Another roommate who lived at the back of the house was woken up by a bright light being shown in her face. However, her boyfriend was also staying with her too, and when the attacker realized that she wasn't alone, he quickly turned and ran. She screamed and woke up the rest of the house, but he was long gone. They quickly called the police. Terrifyingly, just 15 minutes after the officers arrived on scene, they received another call of an attack. He had gone back to the same property where he had attacked the Australian girl. One of the girls who lived there had been at a party that evening and described having a dream where someone was talking and glasses were clinking. Horrifyingly, it wasn't a dream. She was actually hearing the Cambridge rapist smashing glass and attacking one of the residents. Before they knew it, the victim was running around the side of the house, pressing all the bells to the different rooms, trying to wake people up. She had serious cuts and was covered in blood. Bernard Hodson said this had been the most violent attack to date and showed just how depraved and dangerous this man was. Despite the horrific ordeal she had just been through, she was determined to provide the police with a description to try and bring this man to justice. She described him as having a beard, and while the police thought this was most likely a false beard, they created new efits showing what he looked like with it. They also produced a photo of what they believed he looked like without the beard. The police started to draw up a list of the known criminals in the area who had the ability to commit these awful crimes. And one name kept coming up: Peter Samuel Cook. He was an incredibly skilled burglar who had been on the police's radar for an awfully long time. Despite his long rap sheet, he had no history of committing sexual violence, leading the police to wonder whether or not they were questioning the right man at all. But what they kept coming back to was that he was one of only a few known criminals in Cambridge that could break in undetected and leave virtually no trace. He would frequently torment the police with unsolved burglaries that he had committed, and he was cold and arrogant when questioned. He argued that while he was the same height as the rapist, he didn't look anything like the photo fit that had been produced. He also said that he was happily married, and being 47 years old, he was at least 20 years older than the person they were probably looking for. They asked him if he would provide a routine saliva sample to compare with what was found at the crime scenes. But in 1974, it wasn't compulsory for suspects to do this. Peter Cook declined to provide one. The police had no choice but to let him go. Investigators continued to apply pressure to their suspects, and it appeared to work as the attacks suddenly stopped. As the investigation continued, the attacker began playing a game of cat and mouse with the police, whilst also letting the women of Cambridge know he was still there. He would use lipstick to write on the window of the intended victim saying, "Sleep tight, the rapist." For months would pass, and with no more attacks, the police thought that maybe he had gone elsewhere and that the women of Cambridge could begin to relax. This hope, however, was soon shattered on the evening of Sunday, April 13th, 1975. The unthinkable happened. A woman was at home on Marshall Road when the light in her bedroom suddenly went on. She then felt a knife being pressed against her throat by a man in a leather mask with the eyes cut out and a zip across the lips. As in previous attacks, he spent several minutes talking to the victim, describing what he was going to do to her. After brutally raping her, he left her tied up and gagged while he fled the property. She stayed there quietly for the next 4 hours, before she was able to raise the alarm. The seventh attack and the use of a horrifying leather mask had left everyone in shock. The students of Cambridge took matters into their own hands, and a student protection group was formed. Female students could contact the group, and male students would be sent over to sleep at the property and protect the female residents. The response by female students was immediate, and many requested assistance from the student protection group. After examining the samples in the lab, they discovered that semen was present on some of them. Peter Lamb served as a forensic scientist as part of the investigation and found that the perpetrator was a group of secreta. Secretas are those whose blood group substances are also found in their body fluids. They also found something even more interesting. After examining the sample microscopically, they found that the attacker was infertile, either due to a vasectomy or another medical reason. Following discussions with the pathology departments, they estimated that roughly 1 in 10,000 would be infertile in this way. Knowing that the blood type could be found in a saliva sample would lead the police to make an unprecedented decision. They agreed to test every single man to attack a woman, but she was able to escape and alert the police. He wouldn't go quiet for very long, however, as the next day he attacked another woman on Pied Terrace, this time in broad daylight. She had been away for the weekend and her flatmates were away too. After going into her flat, she was confronted by the elusive attacker. Keen to add to his notoriety, he had written "rapist" on the forehead of his leather mask. While he was committing this crime, his victim from the attempted attack the night before had gone to the police station. While his confidence was growing, little did he know that the net was closing in around him and he couldn't run forever. They brought their strongest suspect back in for questioning, Peter Samuel Cook. He was his usual arrogant self and provided police with an alibi. He was in the boatyard talking to the managing director shortly before the attack took place, and was then believed to be in the boatyard as the ambulance went by, taking the victim to hospital from her home. In June 1975, the police were still going out each night for surveillance. The team were briefed by Charles Narn on Saturday, June 7th, and 90 officers were deployed across the city. One of these officers was stationed with another constable on Selwyn Road, behind one of the hedges. They had to stay there and stop anyone who was walking down the street. A short walk away on Allstone Croft, the rapist was breaking into the nurse's residence in the early morning hours of Sunday the 8th. One of the occupiers was in her bedroom when she heard knocking at her door and someone jiggling the door handle. She opened the door but left it on the chain. The rapist tried to force his way through, and armed with a knife, he cut her arm all the way from the wrist to the elbow. She screamed so loudly that it was heard by the fishermen on the bank, who alerted the police, who were told that one of the residents had been attacked and stabbed. All observation teams were put on standby and were ordered to stop everyone they came across. Little did the constables on Selwyn Road know, the Cambridge rapist was heading straight for them. What appeared to be a woman in a blonde wig quickly cycled past them, and further up the road, an undercover officer saw the woman coming towards him. He called out for her to stop, but she didn't. The detective put his foot out, and as the rider came off the bike, so too did the long blonde wig. The officer shouted up to one of the residents who had come to the window after hearing the commotion, telling her he was with the police and she needed to call the station immediately, saying, "I think I've got him, I know I've got him, it's him." The arresting officer was Detective Constable Terry Edwards, who told a reporter exactly what happened. The man was the one they had long suspected, Peter Samuel Cook. Cementing the case against him, a bag he was carrying contained even more damning evidence: the leather mask he had used during his latest attacks, a knife, and the instrument he had used to fuse the lights and plunge the house as he broke into darkness. Cook knew that the game was up, and he eventually confessed. In an outhouse near his caravan, the police found the life that this supposedly happily married man had been so desperate to keep hidden. They found numerous disguises, items he had stolen from different properties, wigs, clothing, underwear that he had stolen from clotheslines. They also found ether, which he had used to overpower some of his victims. But who exactly was Peter Samuel Cook? He was born on the 17th of August, 1928 in Cambridge to respectable parents. However, his run-ins with the law started from a very young age. In his youth, he soon found himself being sent to approved schools. Approved schools were residential schools for young offenders. They were usually sent to a residential school for breaking the law, and could also be sent if their parents were unable to control them. In spite of the school's supposed security, Cook would often find a way to escape and run away. In 1952, whilst on his way to Dartmoor prison to begin a 5-year sentence for store breaking, he found a way out of his holding cell and went on the run. He had been arrested numerous times for committing burglaries and was frequently in and out of prison and mental health hospitals, including Broadmoor, one of the most notorious high-security psychiatric hospitals in the UK. His continued criminality and ability to evade capture carried on as he moved into adulthood. He was often being sent to prison, but would routinely abscond, subsequently becoming one of the most wanted escapees in the country. He lived in a small village called Hardwick, around 5 miles outside of Cambridge, and worked as a delivery driver for Dolmore's Wine Company. His pride and joy was a seafaring boat named after his wife Margaret. Although having no history of sex offenses, it soon became apparent that he had been stealing women's clothing for a long time. There were rumors that he had been thrown out of the army for dressing as a woman, and his 5-year stretch in Dartmoor was for robbing a woman's clothing store. It was also discovered that Cook had a rare condition leading to an extra female chromosome and subsequently became addicted to violent pornography. It is believed that his time in Broadmoor had been the catalyst that had changed him from a serial burglar to a dangerous sex offender. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The following day, he was taken to appear before the magistrate's court, and screaming crowds waited for a glimpse of the man who had terrorized them for so long. He stood silently in the dock with his head down and showed no remorse for any of his actions. One of the magistrates later said he felt he was looking into the eyes of evil, and had he not been stopped, he may well have gone on to kill somebody. At the Crown Court, the horrifying scale of his crimes came to light. He had a collection of keys that could open most of the front doors in Cambridge, allowing him to quietly enter the properties. He had managed to evade the police for so long by planning his next move meticulously. His work as a delivery driver gave him the time to watch the bedsits and know when potential victims would be most vulnerable at home alone. On October 3, 1975, Peter Samuel Cook pleaded guilty to 6 counts of rape. He was handed 2 life sentences for his appalling crimes. The hard work and dedication of the Cambridge police over the 8-month-long campaign of terror had finally paid off. The case captured the public's attention like few others had, and soon became a part of pop culture. Malcolm McLaren was a provocative designer and visual artist, and also known as the manager of the Sex Pistols and the Goo Dolls. He designed a t-shirt featuring the leather mask that Cook had used during his attacks. He and punk fashion designer Vivienne Westwood sold the shirts in the sex boutique shop on the King's Road in Chelsea. Cook spent the first 20 years of his sentence at Leicester High Security Prison. In 1995, he made an application for parole, and there were talks of plans to move him to an open prison. The Member of Parliament for Cambridge and Campbell opposed the moves, arguing he shouldn't be released or have the security surrounding him lowered. Following this, the Home Office Minister Michael Forsyth said that Cook would never be released unless experts could be satisfied that he no longer posed a threat to the public. A year later, he was moved to a low-security prison in Doncaster. On Saturday, the 10th of January 2004, Peter Samuel Cook died in his prison cell of natural causes. He was 75 years old. The horrifying crimes he committed had left a whole community in fear and a trail of destruction and devastation. He never revealed what caused him to commit his dreadful offenses, and those awful secrets died with him. Elizabeth Santos, age 37, lived in Wasilla, Alaska, near Anchorage. Originally from Miami, she first visited Alaska a few years earlier and was captivated by its natural beauty. It was a big change from Florida, but she embraced it. Elizabeth initially worked at a club in Anchorage and commuted between there and Miami before deciding to make Alaska her permanent home. Described as loving and caring with a heart of gold, she had a large circle of friends and enjoyed an active social life. Another reason she chose to settle in Alaska was her boyfriend, Dustin. They had started dating around 2011. Elizabeth returned to Miami as much as she could, and the last time she went to Florida was in March 2020, around the time of her brother's birthday. She had come down with her friend Lizette and another friend. All 3 worked together in Anchorage. Her family reported that during that trip, Everything seemed normal. Elizabeth was happy, healthy, and her usual self. In late July 2020, something had changed. Elizabeth and Destin had broken up. More than one coworker described Elizabeth as upset, but relieved about the situation. One coworker said that she had spoken to Elizabeth about the breakup, and she stated that she believed Elizabeth was scared to go and get her stuff and her dog from their house. On August 3rd, Elizabeth had temporarily moved into Lizette's home to clear her head for a few days following the breakup. Based on statements from friends and family, all seemed normal and they were shocked and in disbelief over the events that took place only 5 days later on August 8, 2020. A 911 call came into dispatchers in Anchorage at around 6 a.m. 2 officers arrived on scene at 6 to 10 a.m. They believed they were attending a call for a person in distress. Based on the 911 call, they were under the presumption that the person was having a mental health crisis. They were let into the home by the homeowner, Lizette, and they found Elizabeth upstairs. They described the house as messy and in a state of disarray with knocked over plants and things scattered everywhere. Elizabeth couldn't speak properly, her speech was slurred, and she didn't appear to be coherent. Officers noted that she only was wearing a thin robe, which was open and revealed what they described to be scratches on her stomach and thighs. Officers asked her what had happened, but she couldn't respond. Lizette also had a few superficial injuries, which consisted of scratches and bruises on her face. An ambulance was called to assist officers, which arrived at 6:46 a.m., half an hour after the officers arrived. Officers handcuffed Elizabeth in the home and walked her down the stairs and placed her in the awaiting ambulance. You can hear the clicking of the handcuffs in this audio clip from audio-only body cam. From the ambulance report, we see that when they were dispatched, they were a code yellow, which according to what I found online means a non-emergency. The ambulance report mentions Elizabeth's last words were the name of the hospital she wanted to go to for permanently losing consciousness. At 7:20, Elizabeth went into cardiac arrest in the ambulance. The paramedics began transport to the hospital at 7:23 a.m. The ambulance report also says they used a stair chair to get her into the ambulance and they used a stretcher to remove her. While they were en route to the hospital, they switched their code to code red, which means full lights and sirens, and headed to the Providence Medical Center. When the ambulance arrived at the hospital 13 minutes later, doctors hadn't been expecting Elizabeth to have such extensive injuries. They counted 11 stab wounds to her abdomen and thighs. Several attempts to stabilize Elizabeth failed during surgery, and she died from excessive internal bleeding at 11:15 a.m. The officers on the scene had claimed that they did not notice the extent of Elizabeth's injuries, although her robe was wide open and the injuries were clearly visible. Months later, superior officers at the APD overseeing the homicide division would claim that the robe Elizabeth was wearing was drenched in sweat, but in this image it looks unmistakably like blood. Moreover, the saturation of blood on the robe is even mentioned in the police report. After Elizabeth was taken into the ambulance, Officers Tae-yoon and Valerie Estrella, the officers that had first arrived at the scene, left Lizette and her 21-year-old son Desmond alone in the home, in an act of crime scene. In the police report, it is noted that Lizette was cleaning blood from the house and during her later interview was asked why she did that, and she said that she didn't want the blood to leave stains. The officers on scene didn't stop her from doing so and she essentially tampered with evidence. Lizette also had access to Elizabeth's iPhone, which she was able to unlock and used it to call Elizabeth's sister in Miami after the officers had left. Officers Ewan and Estrella returned to Lizette's home a little after 8 a.m., and in the police report they say that at that point they arrested both Lizette and Desmond and transported them to the Anchorage Police Department HQ. Desmond is seen not handcuffed and is smiling and waving at people in the cop car. Audio was taken, but there is no way of knowing exactly what objects had been moved around between the time when officers first arrived to when they came back to process the scene. Nor if Lizette and Desmond had changed clothing, since Alaska does not require body cameras on their police officers. Officers also couldn't remember if they saw them change their clothes or if things had moved around from the first time they arrived on the scene to when they came back to process the scene at 8 o'clock. The police report mentions that the clothing that Lizette had worn to the police department was collected for future forensic analysis. DNA swabs and fingerprints were collected from both Lizette and Desmond at that point, but none of this forensic information was ever analyzed, and to date the APD refuses to do so. The following is Lizette's statement to officers about what happened that night. Lizette's story contradicts several times, and in my opinion the officer is using a technique called leading, where he sort of helps the interviewee with leading questions in order to get the narrative to a point. While Lizette has been questioned, officers process the home. They found several knives scattered throughout the house. In the photographs, they all appear to be clean and without any sign of blood. Elizabeth's autopsy and toxicology came back, confirmed that she died from her injuries, but one thing didn't make sense. There had been nothing in Elizabeth's systems, no illegal substances, but there was a medication that the family has confirmed was not used while she was in surgery. It is used in conjunction with anesthesia as a sedative, and there was a lot of it in Elizabeth's system, which didn't make any sense. Versed was usually only prescribed to people who suffered from epilepsy and used only for emergencies. Otherwise, it is only administered by doctors. If someone took this medication, especially in a large unsupervised dose, it would affect their ability to walk, talk, and would cause low blood pressure and sleepiness. And it would cause someone to stop breathing. All of the symptoms from this drug were consistent with the state Elizabeth was in when officers found her, directly contradicting how Lizette had described Elizabeth acting minutes before officers arrived. Lizette said during the first interview that she had given Elizabeth medication, but kept claiming that she only gave Elizabeth Benadryl and that she watched her take it around 3 a.m. If Elizabeth had taken first aid that night, but there was no way Elizabeth could have been marching around the house, slamming things around, walking, going up and down the stairs, banging on doors 1 minute and being essentially catatonic and covered in stab wounds minutes later. Something isn't adding up about Lizette's rendition of events. All that was found in Elizabeth's system were medications consistent with her prescribed medications and cannabis, which in Alaska is legalized. It also didn't appear that Elizabeth had been drinking that night. We can hear on the 911 call that there wasn't anyone banging on Lizette's door. The only thing you can hear is when Lizette is moving from one room to another and you briefly hear a man's voice, which I think we can safely assume is Desmond. This directly contradicts what Lizette had said during her interview. None of this reported noise could be heard in the background. Also, something that should be noted is that Lizette's next-door neighbors were interviewed during the neighborhood canvass. Lizette's home is a duplex that shares walls with the adjoining duplex. For people were home in the other duplex, and none of them reported hearing any of these loud bangings or screaming or otherwise notable noise that caused them concern. Interestingly, during the police canvass, a neighbor mentioned witnessing a disturbance at Lizette's house 2 nights earlier in which a woman matching Lizette's description chased out a man with a truck from the residence. That man was never identified. Officers released Lizette and Desmond, who were allowed to return home later that same day. The crime scene had been processed, but nothing had been tested for DNA or fingerprints. They never determined which weapon, if any of the ones that they had recovered, had been the knife that had injured Elizabeth. Elizabeth's cause of death was noted on her death certificate as undetermined. Lizette had described Elizabeth as acting erratic and out of character. Officers interviewed Elizabeth's co-workers and friends, and nearly all of them said the exact thing. Elizabeth hadn't been acting strangely. They had no reason to believe Elizabeth was in any sort of crisis. Many of them specifically said that Elizabeth was well known for being calm, collected, and poised at all times, and had never been known to be manic. Multiple people also stated that they had been told by Lizette that Elizabeth had slit her own throat, which was completely inaccurate. Elizabeth took antidepressants, which nearly all of her friends knew about. This didn't appear to be something that Elizabeth hid, and she'd been very open about her struggles with anxiety. Her friends also stated that they felt it was well managed. Law enforcement obtained cell phone records for Elizabeth's phone, and it showed several text messages and calls throughout the night. At 2 a.m., Elizabeth was texting a friend, and in the text, she said that she was out walking her dog. Elizabeth was listening to music and ordering items off Amazon in the hours before her stabbing. Between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., cell phone records show that Elizabeth was placing several calls to several friends, but unfortunately none answered. Records show she briefly spoke to Dustin, but hadn't gotten through to anyone else that she was calling. Dustin claimed that when he spoke to Elizabeth that night, she wasn't making sense. After 3 a.m., the phone activity stops. There had been one particular interview that stood out to me. Dustin's sister reached out to the lead detective on the case at around 9:30 p.m., the day after Elizabeth had died. She had just learned about Elizabeth's passing, and dispatch described her as frantically trying to reach the detective. In the case record, she was described as being very upset when speaking to the detective, unprompted, and I'm not sure why she needed to call and say this. But she told the detective that her brother had epilepsy and was very forgetful, which, and this is, in my opinion, is kind of an odd thing to urgently tell a police officer at 9:30 at night. She asked about the investigation and wanted to know what happened to Elizabeth. The officer told her that he couldn't tell her anything because it was an active investigation, and that was the only time she spoke to law enforcement, according to the police files. Remember what I said versus said was prescribed for. This was never an avenue of investigation that law enforcement took. It is something that stood out to me. By October 2020, the case was suspended. That is how it has been since. And like I said earlier, there was no DNA testing, no fingerprint analysis. They never determined how Elizabeth had come to have 11 stab wounds, nor did they determine what knife caused the wounds. In every single interview conducted by law enforcement, one thing was consistent. They always asked if anyone knew if Elizabeth did drugs. Everyone they spoke to said no. When toxicology came back confirming what people had said, they never went any further to explain the state that Elizabeth had been found in. You can hear on the audio when they arrested her almost the disdain they had in their voices. They weren't treating her like a victim. They were treating her like someone who didn't deserve prompt medical care and an annoyance. Other questions I have is, why had the ambulance sat outside the home for so long? 37 minutes. And didn't prepare the attending doctors what to expect when Elizabeth finally made it to the hospital. Law enforcement has not been forthcoming with the Santos family. Her siblings have been fighting tirelessly to get help. They have gone every avenue they can, and they have had doors slammed in their faces every single time. Based on the extent of Elizabeth's injuries, it was long assumed that the knives on the scene would be covered in blood. Notice how Detective Bell never corrects the brother when he asks about the bloody knives. At no point does Bell correct him and say there were no bloody knives found on the scene. It was as if either Bell had never looked at the photos himself or had assumed the family would never see the photos. He even loosely refers to this case as a homicide. At one point, he says that he is working on 3 other homicide cases. Every reporter and journalist contacted in Alaska has ignored the case, despite them interviewing family members and promising to report it. The only thing published was this short article written the day after Elizabeth died. The family feels that more people might come forward with more information if local news actually reported these strange events, and if people knew the details that had gone on in this case. In my opinion, based on what we see here, it almost looks like law enforcement are just waiting for the clock to tick down and we are running out of time. The statute of limitations is approaching and is set to expire in August. The family has reached out to several lawyers in Alaska and they can't find anyone to take Elizabeth's case. The Santos family needs our help getting Elizabeth's face everywhere, getting justice and holding those responsible accountable. To get law enforcement to do more, it has been too long. #Justice for Elizabeth. Natalie Hemming, a 31-year-old mother of 3, resided on Alderney Avenue in Milton Keynes, England, with her partner Paul. Her eldest daughter, Christy, was from a previous relationship, and she had 2 more children with Paul, a 6-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl. Paul and Natalie had been together since 2007. Natalie was known for being loud and outspoken, yet equally kind and caring, as described by her sister Joanne. Her family emphasized that Natalie's children were her top priority, and she was always willing to lend a helping hand to others. Family and friends of Natalie not only didn't believe she'd have left without telling anyone, or left without her children, but they felt that something much darker had happened. They all believed her partner Paul would be at the center of whatever it was. Everyone that knew Natalie told the police that Paul was mentally and physically abusive, controlling, manipulative, and possessive, and had been since the start of the relationship. Just a few months into the pair dating, Paul had become violent. He once drove her to a woods where he beat her and broke her nose. He embarrassed her and talked down to her in front of friends and family, once even spitting in her face in front of everyone. He made her sleep naked on the bedroom floor, and whenever she turned around or tried to get up, he would kick her. Paul had promised to marry Natalie, but called off the wedding 3 times. Natalie went as far as buying her dress, booking the venue and inviting guests, before Paul canceled all the plans without telling her, leaving her absolutely humiliated. Amidst all the cancellations, Natalie changed her surname and took Paul's by way of a compromise. But after years of abuse, Natalie had geared up the strength to leave Paul twice, once in 2010, and then again 3 years later. Her sister Joanne said she had it all planned. She was going to move into her own place with the children and was excited about starting a new life. "I'm really going to do it this time," she told us. In 2013, with the relationship getting worse, she took her 3 children and went to live in Yorkshire close to her sister. Over the next few months, Natalie started to rebuild hers and her children's lives and start afresh. But she moved back in with Paul 4 months later, and her family were devastated. And in 2016, 3 years later, Natalie Hemming was now missing. What followed was one of the biggest searches in the history of the Thames Valley Police. One of Natalie's close friends said that Natalie had texted her in the weeks before she had disappeared. She told her that she had ended it with Paul for good, and she had met someone at work called Simon who totally doted on her. Natalie's friend told her to be careful, but Natalie assured everyone that the relationship with Paul was finally over. They had both agreed to end it amicably, and she was finally moving on. Paul had even started looking for flats to move into, and she was looking at other places to live with the children. Sunday afternoon, April 30th, Natalie drove to her mom's house and dropped off the children before getting picked up by Simon for their very first date. Later that evening, Natalie and Paul's baby girl wasn't settling down, so Margaret rang Paul to come and pick her up. When he arrived, he noticed that Natalie's car was still parked on the street, but Natalie wasn't in the house. He asked where she was. Natalie hadn't said where she was going, so Margaret assumed that she had been picked up with friends to go for a drink. Natalie and Simon were seen out on their first date before leaving the following day on May 1st. They seemed happy and content, and the pair sent messages to each other later that day. Natalie went back to her mother's house to collect her children and her car, and they all headed back to Alderney Avenue. Simon messaged her on WhatsApp just before 5 p.m. The message was delivered and read, but Natalie didn't respond. Later on, he sent 2 further messages, checking to see if she was okay. These messages were delivered, but never opened. Margaret began ringing Natalie too, but got no answer. Margaret decided to go to the house that she shared with Paul. Paul told her she'd gone to spend time with some friends, but her car was still in the driveway, and Margaret instantly felt that something was wrong. After this conversation with Paul, she rang 999 and reported her daughter missing. Following this, the police went straight to Natalie and Paul's home just after midnight. One of the officers asked to have a look at Paul's phone, but he said he needed to keep it with him in case Natalie called. They then asked to do a routine search of the house, which Paul also pushed back on. Paul said that Natalie had been away the previous day, and upon her return to the house, she said she needed some time alone. She gave no indication as to where she was going, but she left the family home, and that was the last time he had seen her. The morning after she was reported missing, following an evasive interview with Paul, the police placed him under arrest. As he was leaving the house, he turned to officers and said, "Have you found Natalie then?" Paul was interviewed, as was his and Natalie's son. Their 6-year-old son said he had heard a noise in the night that was so loud it sounded like thunder and smashing glass. He snuck downstairs and peered through a gap in the door, where he saw his mom lying down, covered in a blanket, and his dad was cleaning something up. Not wanting to get into trouble for being out of bed, he hurried upstairs and went back to sleep. He then innocently made a passing comment to the child protection officers that alarmed them even more. He said the red rug in the living room had wet patches on it and his dad had taken it to work to clean it, but the rug hadn't returned. He drew a diagram for the police of the living room and pointed out where he'd seen everything. Following this, Paul's car was seized and the police made more appeals. During another interview with Paul, he made a shocking claim. He said that he had been home all day on Sunday when Natalie had returned that evening. She was acting oddly and wasn't her usual self. She then confessed to Paul that she had met up with someone from work and gone back to his house. She then said she had been raped by this man and needed space to process everything. Paul said he then went to bed at around 9 p.m. and when he got up the next morning, Natalie was gone. But police knew from looking at the messages between Simon and Natalie, this just didn't match up with what Paul had claimed. Despite Paul saying he hadn't left the house all day that Sunday, his car was picked up at around 10 p.m. that night, driving miles away from their house. A forensic search of the house found blood on some of the furniture in the living room and in the boot of his car. Paul had said that the blood was probably from himself or Natalie, accidentally cutting themselves on something. Mobile data analysis confirmed that Natalie's phone showed no activity from the 2nd of May onwards, and her digital footprint was totally non-existent. With all the information the team had now gathered, police knew that Natalie was no longer alive, and the investigation was escalated from a missing persons case to a murder inquiry. Looking at the timeline of events, they knew that Paul had killed Natalie on Sunday evening, May 1st. They believed that she had returned that day and told Paul she was now seeing Simon. Following this, in a jealous rage, Paul had beaten her to death in the living room, which was partially heard and seen by their son, before he wrapped her body up and drove out to hide her late that night. Paul returned to the family home where the children were still sleeping. When the kids got up the next morning, Paul told them their mother had left the house in the night. He then took the children to Whipsnade Zoo for a bank holiday day out. At 9 p.m. on May 6th, he was charged with the murder of Natalie Hemming. But police still needed to find Natalie's body, and Paul was giving nothing away, refusing to tell anyone where she was. Everyone believed that this was the last bit of control he was trying to cling on to. In woods near Milton Keynes, police search for a missing mum of 3. Natalie Hemming was last seen on Sunday, the 1st of May. Her partner Paul Hemming, who's 42, is charged with her murder. Police have widened the search to Bedfordshire and Oxfordshire with nearly 50 detectives working on the case. 3 weeks after she had been reported missing, human remains were found 30 miles away in a wooded area called Chandler's Cross by a man who had been out mowing a meadow. It was later confirmed that these were the remains of Natalie Hemming. The pathologist said it was impossible to say what exactly had caused her death because of the state of decomposition, but she did have a skull fracture and a fracture to her left arm. At the start of what would be a 9-day trial, Paul pleaded not guilty to murder and instead tried to make a plea of manslaughter. He said that they had grappled with one another during an argument about her new relationship, and he'd hurled a heavy ornament at her. He said he didn't aim it at her head, but it struck her there accidentally, causing her to fall onto the rug and stop breathing. He said he knew she was dead, and then in a state of panic, he set about covering up what he'd done. But the police didn't accept his plea of manslaughter and instead pushed on with the trial to try and obtain a conviction for murder. In November 2016, everyone got what they had been hoping for. A juror unanimously found Paul Hemming guilty for the murder, and he was handed a life sentence with a minimum term of 20 years. Upon his sentencing, officers in the courtroom saw Paul turn to Natalie's mother and sisters and mouth, "I loved every minute." His children have no direct contact with him. Joanne is raising Natalie's 2 girls, and Carrie is raising her son. Joanne is now an ambassador for advocacy after fatal domestic abuse. They support family and friends who have lost a loved one through domestic violence. Kirsty, Natalie's oldest daughter, later spoke out about the brutal way her stepfather had treated her and her siblings. She took part in a documentary called Behind Closed Doors, Through the Eyes of a Child, and she was one of 4 children that bravely spoke out about the domestic abuse they had witnessed or experienced, and the effect of living in such a frightening home. She is also the patron of a charity called Operation Encompass, which helps protect children from the effects of domestic violence. Kirsty has said she is a much more confident and strong person now, and wants to continue to raise awareness and carry on being her mother's voice. 8-year-old Jamie Lavis was the second of 5 siblings. Described as cheeky, mischievous, and adventurous, he was smaller than average for his age, standing just 4 feet tall. His mother, Karen, often had to dress him in clothes meant for younger children, typically 5 to 6-year-olds. Jamie and his siblings enjoyed playing together outdoors in their neighborhood, a common pastime for local children. Despite his adventurous spirit, Jamie had a fear of the dark and always made sure to return home early for dinner. On the bank holiday weekend of May 5th at 5 p.m., the Lavis family gathered for their evening meal, but Jamie had not returned home from playing outside earlier that day. His parents thought he had just lost track of time, or maybe he had gone to a friend's house. But as 8 p.m. came and went and he still wasn't home, his family headed out onto the streets to look for him. They searched for hours, but had no luck, and eventually late that evening they phoned the police. What followed was the biggest investigation in Manchester since the infamous Moors murders. Appeals were being broadcast and everyone was out searching for Jamie. His family were begging for his safe return and many tips and alleged sightings started to come in. Several people said they had seen Jamie catching the 219 bus at around 10:30 a.m. the morning he was last seen. Apparently, he had planned on going to buy his mom a birthday present. Following the sightings of him on the bus, Jamie's sister was approached by a man who said he'd seen someone he thought could be Jamie. The man said he wouldn't happen to be wearing a dark blue Reebok tracksuit, would he? His sister Jane confirmed that he had been. 28-year-old Darren Vickers was a local bus driver who lived just 3 streets away from the Lavis family. He told the family and later the police the boy he now knew to be Jamie had spent virtually all day on his 219 bus. He said Jamie had bought a day-saver ticket and spent several hours riding around and looking out of the window before Darren dropped him off near his home. Over the coming days and weeks, with still no sign of the missing Jamie, bus driver Darren was becoming extremely close to the Lavis family. Everyone was frantic and desperate for answers, and it seemed that Darren Vickers was more than willing and able to help them. He started acting almost as the unofficial spokesperson for the family, conducting press conferences and speaking on their behalf when they couldn't face the media. One officer described him as being like the kingpin of the family. They saw him as a pillar of strength, and he was fighting alongside them to help find Jamie and bring him home. Darren offered to take part in a reconstruction of Jamie's last known movements in the bus station, along with Jamie's brother and his father. But his fixation with the family and the case was starting to be seen as odd and strange. The more he started to insert himself into the family's world, the more the police were questioning why. Even the community was starting to wonder why this random man was so deeply invested. As more time passed, the police started to find his relationship with the Lavis family not only troubling, but downright damaging to the investigation. Sharing facts and updates with the family had become almost impossible because the information would always get back to Darren. One inspector said that Darren had become so involved with the family, the Lavises trusted him more than they did the police. More witnesses on the 219 bus that day were now coming forward, and they were giving a totally different account of the bus journey. Darren's description of Jamie as just another passenger couldn't be further from the truth. Jamie was described as turning the bus into a playground, changing the gears of the bus and giving out tickets to people while standing in the driver's cabin. Terrible, could never dream of it. A young child on the bus like that, just going missing, it's just unbearable to think about. It's just a nightmare for everyone. It's like any child that has a day 7 ticket which you're bored with, it's up to them what they do with it. They pay for the ticket, they can do really what they're pleased with it. Darren had previously said that Jamie had an all-day bus ticket, but this also added more doubt and raised more questions. Children weren't allowed to buy day-saver tickets, and the police started to wonder whether Jamie even had a ticket at all. What the police did know for sure was that Darren was the last known person that admitted to seeing Jamie that day. Police went back to the place where it had all started, the bus station. Hours and hours of footage were analyzed from May 5th, and sure enough, there was Jamie. But the footage also showed Darren Vickers. He could be seen approaching Jamie, ruffling his hair and talking to him for several minutes. Again, this account was very different from what Darren had told the police. At the time Jamie went missing, Darren had only been a bus driver for a mere matter of days. Further investigation into his background led police to look into his work references. All the contacts he had put down were fake, apart from one who turned out to be a convicted pedophile. 3 weeks after Jamie was reported missing, on the 24th of May, officers brought Darren in for questioning. The Lavis family were appalled that he could even be considered a person of interest, let alone a suspect. This was a man they had let into their home, and someone that was spending every waking moment helping them look for their missing boy. Karen, Jamie's mother, said they assumed that the police had drawn a blank and arrested Darren on a whim. "We just got close. It's like one big close family now because we've been out virtually 24 hours a day. All of us involved looking for Jamie." At this point, Darren Vickers was well and truly considered a member of the family, and although the police had their suspicions, they couldn't charge him based on that alone. They needed more, and they had to let him go. The Lavis family waited outside the station for him and threw a party when he was allowed home. They were also upset and angry at the implication that he could have been involved. Darren invited a film crew round to the family home to help clear, "I've got nothing to do with the abduction of James Lavis, and I've got the backing of the Lavis family, relations, everybody." After his house was searched, Darren even moved in with the Lavis family. He then asked Jamie's parents if they would be godparents to the baby he was about to have with his partner. In July, Darren, who was still frequently courting the media, phoned up the local radio station. Numerous listeners started calling in to quiz him on his version of events. Everyone agreed something was very off. As the summer drew to a close, police were now convinced that Jamie Lavis was dead, and that Darren Vickers was behind it. But because Darren was so ingratiated with the family, sharing these thoughts with the Lavises proved impossible, and police had to keep their cards close to their chest. Thanks to some outstanding driving offenses, Darren was arrested and jailed for 10 weeks. This kept him away from the family for a short time while the police moved on with their investigation, trying to find more holes in Darren's stories. On the 14th of October, detectives finally felt they had enough circumstantial evidence to arrest Darren Vickers with the abduction of Jamie, but they still didn't have enough to issue a charge of murder. Jamie's family now had no choice but to accept the reality of what had happened. Darren's fixation with being on or in the media had ultimately tripped him up even more. Some teenagers had recognized his face from the news and went straight to the police with some disturbing stories to tell. They said Darren had tried to lead them into some woods late one night. One of the boys said that Darren had shown him a picture of young Jamie, and then pointed ahead saying, "I think that's him." Darren started walking away, and the teen quickly turned and ran. It was also later revealed that Darren had taken Jamie's older brother, 11-year-old John, into some woods and given him a cigarette. He said to John that this was where his brother was, and if he didn't behave himself, this was where he would end up too. Jamie's sister recalled that he had started showing an unusual interest in John, buying him shoes and a new bike, but he didn't seem to care much for the other children. Following all of these accounts, police began an extensive and meticulous search of the wooded area. In the same location the teens described, half a mile away from the path, officers found some tarpaulin which were covering some clothes. Clothes that matched what Jamie had been wearing on the day he had disappeared. The clothes were taken back to the station, and as they were all laid out to be forensically examined, police found a small jawbone wrapped up in the clothing. More human remains were found scattered throughout the woods, but most of the bones were never found. DNA testing of some milk teeth confirmed these were the remains of Jamie Lavis. Due to decomposition, the cause of death could not be officially determined. Darren was arrested and charged with the abduction and murder of Jamie. Police believe that at the end of his shift that day, Darren took Jamie into the woods in his own car, where he sexually assaulted, killed, and dismembered him. He then set about involving himself with the Lavis family, partly to keep the suspicion off himself, and partly because he had a morbid fascination with the case. He even started to use a scanner to monitor police radio calls, and would turn up at places where Jamie was reported to have been sighted. Darren pled not guilty and a 7-week trial ensued. During the trial, Darren made the shocking claim that Jamie's father had been the one to kill his own son. He alleged that he and Karen had been having an affair and she was carrying his child. Karen was forced to take a blood test to prove the baby wasn't his. Darren Vickers' twisted manipulation of the Lavis family and the media seemingly knew no bounds. 2 years since the story broke about the missing Jamie, at Manchester Crown Court, Darren Vickers was unanimously found guilty. Mr. Justice Forbes praised the police and also the teens that had come forward with their stories about Darren. The judge awarded them £150 each from public funds. After the guilty verdict came in, Darren asked to talk to Detective Chief Superintendent. He finally admitted to abducting, sexually abusing, and murdering Jamie. However, just days later, he contacted the media and retracted this confession. Darren Vickers was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 25 years. He was eligible for parole 5 years into his sentence, but the police worked hard to ensure that this was denied. It is said that Darren has since gone on to brag about the heinous crime to fellow inmates in jail, detailing the abuse and murder. Roy Rainford believes that the day he was taken into custody, they had stopped a serial killer in the making. In 2014, Darren Vickers was attacked in prison with a hammer, suffering 3 skull fractures and broken bones in his hand. The Lavis family talk about Jamie every day, and his siblings make sure that their children know everything about their uncle. Photos of Jamie cover the walls of the home, and Karen said she feels his presence every day. On January 6, 1982, a severe winter storm battered Colorado. Sheriff Harold Bray from Denver was on a flight to California, hoping to escape the snowy blizzards below. However, his plans took an unexpected turn when he noticed something out of the ordinary through the plane's window. Flashing lights caught his attention, a familiar SOS distress signal. 3 short, 3 long, and 3 short pulses of light. Bray immediately alerted the pilot, who recorded the coordinates and contacted the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA. The FAA dispatched 2 smaller planes to investigate the signal. They were able to quickly find the source of the lights. It was a pickup truck. 2 vehicles equipped to handle the whiteout conditions were sent out in a string of miraculous events rescued a man. 30-year-old Alan Phillips had become stranded crossing the Colorado Mountain Pass. He had been traveling without snow chains and his truck became stuck. He had heard a plane flying overhead and used his headlights to flash the distress signal. He had no idea his plan could work. The plane had been flying over 1,000 feet overhead, but it was 20 below and he had run out of options. He had already come to terms with the likelihood of freezing to death in his vehicle. Phillips was asked by law enforcement why he was out there in the middle of the night during a snowstorm, and he claimed that he'd been caught unexpectedly driving from Bailey, Colorado to his hometown in Georgetown. He said he'd spent the evening at a bar and wasn't thinking clearly. The rescue made national headlines, both in applauding Bray's heroic catch, as well as a cautionary tale to remind people to prepare their vehicles for appropriate weather. Phillips was dropped off at home after a long conversation about winter safety, and no one thought much more about it after that. On January 7th, only a day after the Alan Phillips rescue, a grisly discovery was made. The body of a young woman was discovered off of Highway 9 near an overpass at the summit of Hosier Pass. The woman, later identified as Barbara Bobby Jo Oberholzer, had been reported missing by her husband Jeff the previous evening. Bobby Jo had called him after work that evening and let him know that she was going to be home late. A couple of people from work had invited her for drinks and she was going to stay out for a bit. She said she had intended to hitchhike home. This was common in Breckenridge. It was a ski resort town and it was common for people to hitchhike to and from there to surrounding communities. Bobby Jo and her husband lived in Alma, about 30 minutes away. She and her husband had lived in the area for a few years. He was in appliance repair tech, and she worked as a receptionist. It had been widely regarded as a safe community, and this murder case had been quite a shock to the locals. Bobby Jo had been shot twice in the chest. Her cause of death was blood loss from her injuries. She had been found 20 feet from the highway at the bottom of an embankment. Several belongings from her purse were also located, some as far as 20 miles along the highway headed towards Denver. A set of keys was found near Bobby's body, as well as an orange sock. The keys were determined to belong to Bobby, but what confused investigators was that the sock wasn't. Investigators made no secret of who they thought was responsible for the killing, Jeff Oberholzer. There wasn't any evidence tying him to the crime, but the police found it convenient that Jeff had no alibi as he claimed to have been home asleep. When he woke during the night, he got in his truck and headed to the pub that Bobby had been at. Her friends were surprised to see him and told him that she had left hours earlier around 7:38 o'clock. Jeff went to the police that night to report his wife missing, but officers wouldn't file a missing persons report. The next morning, a resident had called Jeff and said that he'd found his wife's driver's license on his property. Jeff drove over there and picked it up. Jeff got some friends together and they started searching along the highway. It was Jeff that spotted a blue backpack in the snow. They pulled over, and with the backpack, they also found Bobby's gloves splattered in blood and several tissues also covered in blood. It was at this point that Jeff was sent home to wait, and the search was put together with locals and law enforcement, and Bobby's body was found. Other evidence collected were shell casings from the presumed murder weapon, one set of footprints that belonged to Bobby, and a plastic cord tied around her wrist. The same day that Bobby Joe's body had been found, law enforcement also perceived another report of a missing woman. She was a waitress and housekeeper in Frisco, but lived in Blue River, all near Breckenridge. And like Bobby Joe, Annette was also known to hitchhike to and from work most days, and again for this community that was very normal. No additional evidence was found in connection to Annette's disappearance, and unfortunately due to bad weather, it had quickly been determined that if Annette's body was in a remote area like Bobby Joe's had been, it would be very difficult to recover after heavy snowfalls. Jeff was interviewed multiple times. He initially claimed to not know Annette, but later called officers to let him know that he'd met her once. He'd been watching the news and saw more photographs of her and realized he'd given her a ride months before her disappearance. Officers had asked Jeff to take a polygraph test, which he consented to and pass. He had always maintained his innocence as well as annoyance with law enforcement's insistence that he had something to do with his wife's murder. 6 months after Annette's disappearance, her body was located on July 6, 1982. She was found in a rural area in Park County, 20 miles from where she was last seen. She had been shot once in the back and had also died from blood loss from a gunshot wound. Annette had been sexually assaulted, and it appeared that she may have been redressed by her killer or been forced to redress quickly as her clothing was in disarray. Noticeably missing an orange sock. Officers put together a framework of what they believed had happened on January 6th. They estimated that Annette had been picked up first, around 5 p.m. The suspect drove her to a remote area, sexually assaulted her, and Annette had escaped the vehicle. Her killer had shot her once in the back and left her to die. The man then went back to Breckenridge, where he found a second victim, Bobby Joe, and abducted her. Bobby Joe had not been assaulted, and she had been shot in the chest twice, which led investigators to believe that Bobby Joe may have been trying to reason with her attacker. Jeff said that Bobby would never have accepted a ride from a stranger. He had always believed it was someone from the area that she knew that had committed these murders. Officers had always believed both murders were committed by the same man. Jeff was cleared years later by DNA evidence. Other suspects had been a cab driver who had assaulted a hitchhiker in 1982, and while in jail he had bragged to a cellmate about committing 2 murders and getting away with it. Another suspect was Henry Lee Lucas. Another serial killer, Tracy Petrelli. All were cleared by DNA. 2 other persons of interest were also cleared by DNA. Was that a woman that had been talking to Annette before her abduction, and a man whose photograph was found in Annette's wallet. Neither were identified or found for questioning. The case eventually went cold. It had been featured in the media several times and was the subject of Unsolved Mysteries in 1991. It had been a case that had been actively worked for decades. They had the killer's DNA both from Annette's body and on the tissues and glove from Bobby's, and what they needed was for technology to catch up. In 2021, the case was put forward by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for Genetic Genealogy. At the time, it was recognized as a relatively new option for solving cold cases, but it seemed like the only hope to solve this case. And nearly 4 decades after the murders, they had a suspect. On February 24th, Alan Lee Phillips was arrested without incident. The 70-year-old mechanic was picked up in Dumont, Colorado, and arrested for 2 counts of kidnapping, murder, and assault. Phillips had lived in the area his entire life and had likely been known to both women. He is also being investigated on other crimes in the area as officers feel that due to the level of violence involved in the killings, these 2 women would be unlikely to be his only victims. When it was made public that Phillips was the killer, a man involved in the rescue operation that had saved Phillips in 1982 made the connection. that finally gave context as to why Phillips had been out on the Guanella Pass all those years ago. He had become stuck while fleeing the scene of the murder. No one had even put two and two together. In 1982, Phillips had been 31 years old. He had never been a suspect. He went on to marry, have children, and live his life. And I think Annette's sister's statement to the media says it's best. You had 39 years of freedom, and hopefully now it will all be taken away from you. 39 years of freedom too long. Phillips is being held in jail without bond while he waits trial. There have been several delays so far, but it is expected to go forward sometime this year. Christy Lynn Floyd and her sister Kim grew up in foster care. Kim remembers Christy as a kind and quiet girl who loved animals and basketball. As teenagers, they left their foster home to live with their mother on West Gray Street in Richmond, Virginia. By June 1986, Christy had been in Richmond for 2 years, working at a nearby Hardee's. It was there that she met an 18-year-old guy during one of her shifts, and they started dating. The day before Christy disappeared, she and her boyfriend decided to run away together. However, Christy's mother found out and contacted the boyfriend's mother. She threatened to accuse him of statutory rape unless Christy was brought back home. So, the next morning, Christy came home. Her sister Kim recalls talking to her that morning as she was running out to get some food. It was the last time she saw her sister. The family filed a missing persons report in Richmond, but according to Kim, the police didn't take her sister's disappearance seriously. Her family submitted her information to America's Most Wanted, put her photo on milk cartons, hired private investigators, and made flyers that they passed out at truck stops. But there was no sign of Christy. 2 months later, on August 7, 1986, workers were unloading trash at the Shoesmith landfill in Chesterfield County, Virginia, when they came across a leg, foot, and torso. They were unable to identify the victim, but suspected it was a white female between 22 and 32 years old. Christy's family was never contacted about the discovery. In 2019, the police sent a portion of the remains to DNA Labs International in Florida, and a DNA profile of the victim was developed. They then sent the profile to Parabon Nanolabs, who were able to use DNA phenotyping to produce a composite image of what the victim could have looked like, which they call a snapshot DNA analysis. That analysis revealed the victim likely had fair or very fair skin, brown or hazel eyes, and brown or black hair. Police revealed she was wearing size 7 or 7.5 shoes, had pink toenail polish on, and a rubber-like bracelet on her ankle. Later on, Kim revealed that Christy regularly wore jelly bracelets on both feet. On March 2, 2020, Detective Chris Humphreys released the snapshot DNA analysis to the public, and he started getting phone calls from across the country almost immediately. One of the first calls he received was from retired Richmond homicide detective Mark Williams, who worked with Christy's family years prior. He recommended Detective Humphreys contact Christy's family to see if it was a match, and he did. Kim's son, Dustin, then used a DNA kit to gather a DNA sample and sent the results to the detectives, and within 24 hours, they were able to confirm a familial match. In March of 2020, the Chesterfield Police Criminal Investigation Division confirmed the remains belonged to Christy, but what happened to her remains a mystery. The police are still seeking information on what happened to Christy and encourage anyone with details to come forward and help bring closure to the family. Unfortunately, the identity of Christy's boyfriend at the time of her disappearance is still unknown, as no one can remember his name, and the initial police report can't be located. In one photo, Christy is pictured with her former boyfriend Chris, who she dated prior to dating the boy she was with at the time of her disappearance. The police and family are looking to find and speak with Chris. He's not considered a suspect at this time, but they believe he may be able to help the investigation. In the summer of 1980, 15-year-old Carrie Patterson and her family moved from Cerritos, California to Fullerton, just under 10 miles away. According to her mother, Crystal, they moved there for Carrie's safety. She said that Carrie was getting bullied at her school by other girls, and it was getting physical. "The only reason we moved is because of her," she said. "It was out of pure worry on my part. I wanted to get her into Sunny Hills High." On June 16, 1980, Just 2 weeks after arriving in Fullerton, Carrie went missing. She left home to meet a male friend and a few of his friends from her old neighborhood at Ice Cream Castle, approximately a mile from her house. Afterward, she rode on her friend's bicycle handlebars, and he dropped her off near Parks Junior High School, where they parted ways. The school was only a few short blocks from her home, but she was never seen again. Carrie's parents reported her missing and started distributing missing persons flyers throughout the area. Authorities initially labeled her as a runaway, but her parents knew that wasn't the case. In the weeks following, police sifted through various reports of people claiming they saw or talked to Carrie after her disappearance, but they were all deemed false. 6 months later, on December 27, 1980, the upper portion of a skull and 2 arm bones were found by an oil worker in a field near Tunner Canyon and the 57 freeway in Brea, 12 miles from where Carrie was last seen. Her mother, Crystal, read about the discovery in the local newspaper and kept the clipping in her wallet for weeks before finally reaching out to see if it was Carrie. Soon after, investigators were able to match the skull to Carrie using dental records. The police examined Carrie's case in 1980, 1981, 1994, 2011, and 2014, but haven't been able to establish any strong leads. Bob Taft, the Orange County Sheriff's Department cold case detective, said the boys Carrie was with on the day she disappeared were the last people to see her alive, but are not suspects. In 1994, convicted killer David Campbell claimed he murdered a man named William Raber because he suspected Raber killed Carrie. But police believe this was a lie and that Campbell was able to construct the story because he stayed up to date on the news around the case. In December of 2019, a woman read an article about the case in the Orange County Register and reached out to the police in January 2020. She lived in the same area as Carrie and said she remembers seeing a suspicious person on her street the day Carrie went missing. According to the woman, the man stood out so strongly that she could still vividly remember what he looked like. They developed a sketch based on her description and have released it to the public, hoping to identify and speak with this person of interest. In December of 2021, the Orange County Sheriff's Department put out a story on Carrie's case and soon after received a tip that said, "You need to check out the case of Wendy Osborne." In 1987, 14-year-old Wendy was kidnapped while walking to school in Placentia, California. Her body was later found in Carbon Canyon. DNA collected from her remains led police to a man named Raymond Bartlett, who was already in prison for an unrelated kidnapping and rape case. Bartlett was convicted of Wendy's murder and died in prison at the age of 45. A formal connection between Bartlett and Carrie's case has not been made. Carrie's case remains unsolved. Anyone with information is encouraged to contact investigator Bob Taft or provide an anonymous tip to the Orange County Crime Stoppers. In November of 1989, Wanita Jones was on the cusp of a new and exciting venture. The 32-year-old had just put in her 2 weeks' notice at the Circle K convenience store, where she worked, and she was going to open a restaurant. It was a long time coming for the Houghton, Louisiana resident. She'd always had a passion for cooking and had been working 2 jobs to save enough money to open her restaurant, Down Home Barbecue. But on November 13, 1989, that dream was tragically cut short. Around 10:30 p.m., a customer walked into the Circle K at the corner of Bodcow Station Road and Highway 80 to find Wanita behind the counter suffering from a gunshot wound to the head. The customer immediately called the police and Wanita was taken to Bossier Medical Hospital, where she passed away 5 days later. According to the Bossier Parish Sheriff's Office, it appeared Wanita was shot during a robbery as the cash register was open and money was missing. With no cameras on the premises and no witnesses to the crime, police had little to go on. Unfortunately, the leads they did receive weren't consistent and didn't have the information or evidence needed to make an arrest. Wanita's family believes the shooter was familiar with Wanita and knew her schedule. Investigators say the suspect may have ties to the Houghton and Shreveport areas, but they have yet to make an arrest in the case. Wanita's family kept her restaurant open for years after her death as a symbol of their love and respect for her. She is remembered by friends and family as a strong, independent, and driven person. It was 1967 in Syracuse, New York, and summer was coming to a close. Soon, 14-year-old Mary and Marzullo and 13-year-old Jacqueline Saunders would be heading back for another year at Roxborough Road Junior High School. But until then, they would enjoy the rest of their summer break. On Friday, August 11th, the two friends attended the Mattydale Firemen's Field Days in Mattydale, New York. They had planned to walk home and stopped at a market on Main Street in North Syracuse at around 10:30 p.m., where Marian called her family. She said they were running late, but would be home soon. They were last seen walking northbound on Brewerton Road between 10:45 and 11 p.m. When they didn't return home by the agreed-upon time, their family started searching for them. Early the next morning, they reported the girls missing. Around noon the next day, a fisherman and his two sons found the girls' bodies in a marshy field along the Chittenango Creek in the town of Cicero, New York, northeast of Syracuse. Their hands had been tied behind their backs with rope, and an autopsy revealed they'd been strangled to death. Police suspect the girls may have accepted a ride home on their walk, and that they'd been driven to the area where their bodies were found. A witness contacted the police and reported that they saw the girls in a car that day and provided a description of the vehicle, but the case went cold. A similar crime occurred in July of 1966, when the bodies of two suburban Rochester girls were found on a deserted lane. The victims were George and Formicola, 14, and Kathy Bernhard, 16. They'd gone missing after not returning home from an afternoon swim, and their bodies were found a month later. Their murders were never solved, and no official connection has been made between the two cases. At the time of Jacqueline and Marian's murders, District Attorney Frank Galtieri said he expected to make an arrest within a few days. Police have since received and reviewed several leads, but the case remains unsolved more than 50 years later. Still, New York State Trooper Jack Teller believes there's hope in solving the case, so long as they keep it in the public eye. Vince Wesselman was a veteran of the United States Army. Even after leaving the Army, he remained dedicated to serving others. While he was employed by a stove company and later a formal wear shop, he was most well known for the work he did on a volunteer basis. He used a week of his vacation time every year to volunteer at a Catholic retreat camp, and he was a longtime volunteer with Habitat for Humanity. He loved to garden and donated the produce he grew to a local food bank. Vince was not married and had no children of his own, but was dedicated to his large family. He had 11 siblings and numerous nieces and nephews. When he built himself a house in Breeze, Illinois in the mid-1960s, he had his parents, as well as several of his younger siblings, move in with him. He took care of his parents until their deaths. In 2011, 75-year-old Vince finally retired. He was just a few weeks into his retirement when Holy Week began. As a devout Catholic and an active member of St. Augustine Church, Vince had plans to attend church on the several days leading up to Easter Sunday. He spent most of Holy Thursday, April 21st, tearing out flooring in his house that needed to be replaced with his brother, Jerry. The last known sighting of Vince was at 5 o'clock that evening, when a neighbor saw him walking down North 1st Street in front of the Breeze Green Company. Vince liked to stay active, walking or biking every day. Part of his daily routine was also walking down to the post office to buy a newspaper. It is believed that this is what he was doing when he was seen by his neighbor. He has not been seen since. Because Vince was close with his family, they knew that something was wrong when they could not get a hold of him to discuss their plans for Easter. On Saturday morning, two of his sisters went over to his house to check on him. His church clothes were laid out on the bed, waiting to be worn for one of the Holy Week services. Vince's car, bike, wallet, and keys were all inside the home, which showed no signs of forced entry or a robbery. The only thing missing was their brother. The community that Vince had given so much to now came together to try to help him. Members of the community went door to door, asking for information and searching small buildings. Others took their boats out on area bodies of water to search. 2 search and rescue teams, a small aircraft, and nearly every fire department in Clinton County were a part of the search for Vince. A pond was drained, and firefighters pumped water out of an old cellar at the grain company. Neither Vince nor any clues indicating what may have become of him, were found, despite the massive effort. In July of 2018, Vince was declared legally dead, and his family held a memorial mass for him. They have not given up hope of finding answers, however. A $10,000 reward is still being offered for information in Vince's case. Bill Wasco was a 65-year-old Vietnam War veteran who lived in Marietta, Georgia. He was an avid outdoorsman going on hikes throughout Georgia. He also loved Joshua Tree National Park in California and made a visit there almost every year. On June 23, 2010, Bill flew from Georgia to Los Angeles. He rented a car at the airport and drove to Rancho Mirage, where he would be staying in a vacant condo that belonged to a friend. The following morning, he drove to the park for his first day of hiking. Bill had left a detailed itinerary of the hikes he planned to make on this trip, not all of which were within Joshua Tree National Park, back in Marietta with his girlfriend, Mary Winston. Mary was concerned about the hike Bill was planning to make on that first day. Bill wanted to hike out to Carey's Castle, an old miner's hut. The site is so unstable and in such a remote location that the National Park Service does not include it on most maps in an effort to keep people from trying to visit it. Bill had reassured Mary while he was still in Georgia, and when he spoke to her on the phone during his drive to the park, that he would be fine during his solo hikes. He made plans with her to call her around 5 p.m. that night, when he estimated he would complete the hike. He was then going to go to dinner at Pappy and Harriet's, a restaurant in nearby Pioneer Town. However, Bill did not call Mary by 5 p.m. that evening. She began calling him, but all of her calls went straight to his voicemail. By the time enough time had passed that she was sure something was wrong, the park's headquarters had closed. It would not be until 8 o'clock the following morning that she would be able to get in contact with a park ranger and alert them to the fact that Bill was missing. Park rangers immediately traveled to the trailhead where Bill would have parked in order to hike out to Carey's Castle. But Bill's rented white Chrysler Sebring was not there, and it appeared as though no vehicles at all had been there in some time. The car would not be found until almost 5 p.m. the following day, when a California Highway Patrol helicopter spotted it parked near the Juniper Flats trailhead, which was a 90-minute drive from the Carey's Castle trailhead. This was a common parking area for hikers who were planning to hike up Quail Mountain. Quail Mountain had been listed on Bill's itinerary for his trip, so the search efforts centered on this location. Search and rescue groups from all across Southern California came out to help look for Bill. Volunteers searched on foot and on horseback, and helicopters and small aircraft scanned the area from above. Dogs were brought in to try to track Bill's scent. Databases and algorithms were applied to the case and the terrain in an effort to refine the search area. A major but confusing clue came from Bill's cell phone records. At 6:50 a.m. on June 27th, 3 days after Bill went missing, his phone pinged off of a rise in cell tower just outside of the park. Bill's phone was 10.6 miles from the tower, which was above the town of Yucca Valley to the northwest of the park, when it pinged off of it. However, this location was so far from Quail Mountain that officials doubted that Bill could have reached it on foot in 3 days. Numerous theories about technological or environmental factors that could have skewed the data provided by the cell phone tower have been suggested, but none of them have been confirmed. This ping was the only activity on Bill's cell phone after he entered the park, most likely because of the lack of service in some of the remote areas he was in, or because he turned off his phone to conserve its battery. Despite a meticulous search that seemingly covered every square inch of a massive search area, Bill was not found. The official search was finally called off. On July 5th, while the official search for Bill is long over, unofficial searches for him continue to this day. By 2018, other hikers had cataloged more than 1,000 miles of trails that they had searched for Bill's remains. Despite such extensive efforts, Bill has still not been found. On March 16, 1977, tragedy struck when Richard Bachell, Sr. was killed during an attempted burglary while at home with his children and wife. Our next case takes us to Alameda, a city in Alameda County, California, located in the East Bay region of the Bay Area. The city is primarily located on Alameda Island, but also spans Bay Farm Island and Coast Guard Island, as well as a few other smaller islands in San Francisco Bay. Richard Bishell Sr. was born in 1934 in the United States of America. He was known as a kind man who would do whatever he could to help his friends and even strangers if it was possible. In his teens, he decided to join the military and became a U.S. Marine. He served in the Korean War in the 1950s and was respected as a great soldier and one of the finest of his generation. After his service, he retired from duty and worked as a mechanic and lived on the 2500 block of Lincoln Avenue in Alameda with his wife and 3 sons. He was beloved by his community and his family as a great husband and father, and a man who was kind and generous to all he met. However, while life seemed to be going well for the Bishell family in 1977, disaster was just around the corner. In the early hours of the morning of March 16, 1977, there was a break-in and a tip to burglary at the Bishell home. The thief was unable to escape unnoticed and was chased out of the house by a then 43-year-old Richard and his 17-year-old son. Richard Bishell Jr., the father and son, chased the intruder onto the street, and as they pursued the thief, the younger Richard fell behind, unable to keep up with his father and the burglar. By the time he caught up with his father, he found him lying on the ground, and the burglar was nowhere to be seen. Richard Jr. found his father in a pool of blood with multiple stab wounds. In a haze, he ran back to the house and called the police and an ambulance. Richard Sr. was rushed to the hospital, but sadly it was too late, and he succumbed to his injuries a few hours later. His family was devastated by these events and were desperate for his killer to be brought to justice. At the time, investigators determined the victim, Richard Bishell Sr., was stabbed a total of 10 times after confronting an individual who had attempted to burglarize his home, and the motive for the murder was chalked up to a burglary gone wrong. With this motive in mind, investigators looked at a number of possible suspects, including individuals with a past record of burglary, who had been convicted earlier. At the time, the investigation identified Richard Curly Bernard as a possible suspect and even searched his home, where they found a blood-stained jacket after the murder. However, due to limitations in DNA technology, charges could not be filed, and this piece of evidence was locked away in storage in the hopes that it could be used when technology advanced. With a lack of other leads, the investigators eventually hit a dead end, and the case turned cold. Over 4 decades went by, and in 2021, the Alameda Police Department quietly established a cold case unit. It was composed of a small team of retired Alameda police officers and 2 sergeants who were still active on the force. The unit is led by retired Detective Lorenzo Graham. Bishell Jr. had asked that his father's case be reopened 23 years prior to this in the late 1990s. But at the time, the police force was reluctant to do so, as they were unsure whether the technological resources required to solve this case were available. However, once the cold case unit was started in 2021, the Richard Bishell murder was one of the first cases they chose to reopen, due to the fact that they had a great deal of evidence from the case stored away. They began by submitting the bloody jacket confiscated from the suspect Bernard's home, as well as other pieces of evidence, to the Serological Research Institute, a non-profit California corporation that provides a broad spectrum of biological testing services. When the blood on the jacket was tested, it came back as a positive match to Richard Bishell. Senior APD had questioned Bernard shortly after the murder, but the technology at the time did not give them the ability to determine whose blood it was. But that had now changed with the advancement in technology, said the lead detective Lorenzo Graham. With this positive match, along with circumstantial evidence, the detectives had found it was finally proved that Richard Curly Bernard was the killer of Richard Bishell Sr. all those years ago. The detectives immediately began to look for Bernard, hoping to charge and arrest him for the murder. But they were left disappointed. They found out that Bernard was a career criminal who was arrested and convicted for a series of Alameda burglaries and 2 non-sexual assaults in the 1970s. Bernard was also alleged to have committed more than 100 burglaries. He was imprisoned in 1977 after being convicted for a number of burglaries and the 2 counts of sexual assaults, but was released from jail in 1983. Upon his release, Bernard was paroled to the state of Texas. They found that in 1989, Bernard was killed in an act of carrying out another crime. Though justice could not be served to the criminal, the Alameda Police Department announced at a press conference on March 22, 2022, that the department had finally solved the 45-year murder investigation. While Bernard is deceased and therefore cannot face his day in court, we have given the opportunity to provide answers to the Bishell family, said Lorenzo Graham. At the press conference at the Alameda Free Library, Richard Bishell Jr., who was with his father all those years ago on the fateful night of the robbery, was also present at the press conference. It's been a long, hard road, but I'm glad we have a final resolution to this. On behalf of my family, my late mother, my 2 younger brothers, I'd like to just say thank you to everyone, Bishell Jr. said. I don't know if there's any real closure, you know? It doesn't change a whole lot, but we are glad we do have a final positive ID, and we can go from there. Though it is truly sad that justice could not be served to Bishell Sr.'s murderer, we hope that his family and friends can find solace and some form of closure in knowing who was responsible for his untimely and tragic death. Dakia Finitzi served in the United States Army for 5 years. In 2007, the 26-year-old mother of 3 was living in Verona, Mississippi. She was going to school to get her degree in criminal justice and was working as a security guard at the Fillmore Center, an alternative school in Tupelo, Mississippi. The Fillmore Center would be the location of the last known sighting of Dakia. On October 12th, she dropped a friend off at the center in her red Pontiac Grand Am. Later that day, she failed to pick up her children from her sister's home, and her sister reported her missing to the Verona Police Department. Dakia's vehicle was eventually found at the Warfield apartment complex on Jackson Street in Tupelo. According to witnesses, the car had been driven into the parking lot at a dangerous speed, and an African-American man in a white t-shirt and blue jeans had run from the car after parking it, disappearing behind one of the apartment buildings. J.E.B. Long became the new police chief of Verona in January of 2008. Because Dakia's case had already gone cold by the time he was put in charge of it, he made the decision to turn the case over to the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation in hopes that their more extensive resources would be able to finally move the case forward. In March of 2008, authorities put up a digital billboard with Dakia's picture and case information in hopes of generating new leads, but nothing came of the effort. According to Dakia's family, she would never have abandoned her children. Her disappearance remains unsolved. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.